Is Microsoft Unified Support busting your IT budget? Well, you're not alone. US Cloud is the global leader in third-party Microsoft enterprise support, and they're helping enterprises slash cost by 30 to 50% versus Microsoft Unified, all while getting faster response times from domestic engineers. No offshoring, no long waits, just expert support you can count on 24/7, 365. Trusted by 50 of the Fortune 500 companies and offering senior-level engineers with an average of 14 years experience with Microsoft technologies, US Cloud is the smarter alternative for premium Microsoft support without the premium price. Ready to make the switch? Book a call at uscloud.com to get started today. That's uscloud.com.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective, and it's been a good weekend so far. Been watching the Masters, spread 15 yards of mulch. A lot of stuff outside. The weather's starting to get nice, and things feel pretty good. Spring is feeling pretty good so far. So hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's kind of getting into spring, getting into being outdoors a little bit. And want to dive into a article that was written by a friend of the show, Mark Hinkle, who we've had on before. Mark's somebody we've known for a very long time. Somebody who's been deeply involved with very early days of cloud, has been heavily involved with a lot of activities around AI, especially kind of just deployments and implementations and actual real perspective with AI. So somebody that, we like to kind of tap into from time to time. He writes a really good, he's involved with a lot of things. He runs a website called the Artificially Intelligent Enterprise. And he had an interesting article this week called, Why AI Isn't Meeting Expectations, Why Most AI Projects Stall, and What It Takes to Move from Pilots to Productivity. And I thought it was an interesting article. He goes into a lot of pretty good points, both things that he's heard anecdotally from working with people, as well as some research is out there. And so I kind of want to dive into that today. Want to sort of look at kind of the framework that he uses, but also some perspective of things that I've been seeing in working with a number of customers. And then just kind of some anecdotal things. And I feel like, far too often, because I've been around for a long time, I try and put things into historical context. But I do think, articles like this are useful. But I think at the same time, they're also, sometimes maybe a little hyperbolic in terms of, where we realistically are in terms of a very, very new technology paradigm that's sort of taking over, making people think about a lot of stuff. And so we're going to dig into that right after the break.
This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/cloudcast.
And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, great to be back with everybody. Weekend perspective. Want to dive into this Mark Hinkle article. It is linked in the show notes. Again, Mark's a friend of ours from here in Raleigh. We've worked with Mark quite a bit. Somebody we've known for a long time. A lot of respect for Mark. But like I said, he wrote this article this past week. He writes a ton of stuff on the Artificial Intelligence Enterprise website. Again, linked in the show notes. And he kind of digs into what he's calling sort of some unmet expectations for AI. And again, let me kind of walk through some of the things that he's got in here, and then I'll kind of try and provide some context around it, as well as another way of framing it that I tend to use for myself. So, he basically said, hey, AI is on every boardroom agenda. Very true. AI is one of the fastest adopted technologies ever. True, although I think this is one of these things where, previous generations of technology have allowed new things to spread very rapidly, but, still happening. And then he just sort of says that, most companies aren't yet realizing business value. And I think all three of those are very true. I think, you can look through a lot of stuff. While there are some success cases out there, I think the reality is most companies aren't yet realizing business value, because the reality is most companies aren't yet putting a lot of AI into production. And, this is one of these situations in which, that's sort of a broad blanket statement. I think there are plenty of examples already of companies who have, put it into production, are getting benefit out of it. But I think as a whole, if you were to sort of draw a continuum, there is a very typical kind of crossing the chasm sort of curve that we have. We are still in the very, very early days of, generative AI as a technology as a whole, let alone it being deployed in the enterprise with kind of all of the extra complexities that go along with the enterprise versus what's in the in the consumer world, in which you don't have to worry about regulation and certain security things and validity of your data and all that kind of stuff. So just a couple of points of data that Mark points out. According to McKinsey, only 13% of companies report meaningful value from Gen AI at scale. Accenture found that most of the 2,000 projects they analyzed were in pilot mode. Deloitte reports that governance, security, and compliance risks are rising, not failing. Every one of those things sounds very much like standard, typical early adoption of enterprise technologies, and so forth. So again, the numbers at this point seem what you'd kind of expect them to seem. Now, the reason why you might write a headline that says that AI is not meeting expectations is partially because it's really important to remember, if you use what originated as consumer technology, right, sort of global scale technology, but consumer technology, and then you try and apply enterprise metrics to it or enterprise expectations to it, you're not necessarily going to be anywhere near what most enterprises expect. So let's just sort of start with that, so we don't get into a lot of hyperbole that the sky is falling and things are terrible. I think the second piece of it is, and this is something that I think is sometimes hard for people to necessarily wrap their head around, because the numbers that are being thrown around with generative AI right now, the amount of investment that's happening, everything is on the order of like tens of billions of dollars, and numbers that people kind of, as human beings, have a hard time wrapping their head around what those things mean. So when expectations kind of get thrown around, it's like, well, yeah, there are places in the world, in the internet, where the numbers that are being thrown at them are so large. And again, part of this is because right now this technology is fantastically expensive, incredibly expensive. And we've talked about this numerous times on the show, whether it is the cost of GPUs, whether it's the cost of training models at the scale that they're doing it, whether it's the cost of building new data centers to be able to house all these GPUs, the amount of power it takes, all of these things are sort of overwhelming, right? And so I think it's important to sort of disconnect the people that are, I don't want to say disconnect, but sort of set aside to a certain extent the people that are trying to almost rebuild or build a parallel or different internet, in very, very short periods of time. And what a typical sort of enterprise might be trying to do in terms of augmenting their business, right? So again, not trying to discredit what Mark's talking about, but just trying to kind of put it in some context and so forth. So, looking through here, he highlights a number of things that are, causing failure patterns, right? First is, tech first and people last. So very much, not aligning sort of use cases to how people might use the technology. We're sort of, throwing technology out there and hoping it'll sort of work. Again, AI is going to be a technology that is going to have, as much as we talk about it being able to do all these amazing things, it's going to have very much some sort of human interaction. And because it is in some cases augmenting humans, in some cases sort of replacing human tasks, it's probably an even more complex figuring out of what that human interaction or non-interaction is going to be. The second sort of thing he points out is sort of, garbage in, garbage out. So, bad data architectures, bad data workflows. We've seen this before, right? Like we've seen this before with, sort of the first generation of big data analytics, data lakes, right? Just, big ideas. Hey, if all of the information of the world is in this one giant thing, we're going to be able to query it and ask it all sorts of questions. And, the challenges for most of it was, your data is siloed, your data is not in the right formats, your data is not life cycled the way it should, all sorts of things like that. So we're seeing a second sort of generation of that happen. Third thing he has is AI with no sponsor, right? And I think this is sort of an interesting one to sort of lay out, because we have seen, we saw more than a decade ago, many companies saying, hey, we have an AI first strategy. And they might have said, hey, our CEO said we're going to have a cloud first strategy. I think the thing with generative AI, it was really one of those technologies in which, somewhat like when the mobile phone from the smartphone first came out, it was a big paradigm shift in terms of kind of so many people, technology centric people and non technology centric people, could kind of get their hands on it and kind of understand it. I mean, like anybody could go get a ChatGPT account or a Gemini account or a Claude account. Didn't have to be a software developer. You didn't have to be a data scientist, and you could kind of get some value out of it. And so I think we're right now, and I've seen this in lots of companies that I've had a chance to talk to. It's very fragmented as terms of how companies are going about their AI strategy, what they're deploying, how they're figuring out what technologies work, whether it's being pushed from the top down from the CEO with very large budgets applied to it or very large projects, or whether it's being done sort of bottoms up for people trying to figure things out. And then, as they figure out like, well, will this align to some sort of policy? Is the security team involved? So it's definitely very fragmented at that point. So I would agree with that. A couple other things he points out, infrastructure that can't keep up. I think that's more of a, gigantic industry level sort of challenge. We've seen this, talked about a lot, right? The amount of energy that people like Jensen Huang talk about that are needed to run these massive data centers is way beyond anything that we have available to us today. And while there's people talking about, well, if we deregulated some things, or if we made it easier to, open new power plants and so forth. Those are all fine, right? Those are all possibilities of what's possible. But the reality is, those things aren't going to happen overnight. And so, again, challenge, but the timing and the expectations don't sort of align to those sort of things. So Mark goes on to highlight a number of things as far as some strategic shifts or ideas for making it work. And I think it's a good read. It's worth going through. I wanted to kind of go through some things and try and put some stuff try and put them into context. Because I think with any new technology, we've learned a lot. A lot has evolved, even from the earliest internet days of 20 years ago to the cloud days of 10 years ago to now with AI. A couple of things have really evolved. Number one, we have seen on the consumer side of things that they tend to be, the things that are successful on the consumer side tend to be sort of winner take all. And that's why we're seeing so much money being invested into this market space, into this technology space, because venture capitalists, governments, large companies are sort of saying, the only game that we sort of understand anymore is kind of winner take all, or like first mover has to be giant mover. There is no sort of like fast follower, or at least that's the kind of the belief. And so, we're seeing lots and lots of people sort of pushing all of their chips in. And, again, what that's sort of doing is it's just widely kind of skewing perceptions, right? That people are looking at and they're going, there is so much money being put into this. How can you not figure things out when there's hundreds of billions of dollars? Gosh, you should have no low limitations in what you could do. And this is a little bit of, 9 women can't make a baby in, 1 month, right? The process takes time. The learning curve takes time. The evolution of the technology stack takes time. And so, I think we are, we always have to kind of keep coming back to, we are 2.5 years, so 30 months into something that is being, kind of described to the world as world-changing technology, right? Like this isn't going to happen overnight. And given all the constraints that there are in terms of hardware constraints, GPU constraints, power constraints, and all those sort of things, those things are sort of out of whack. I think the second piece to kind of remember is, really for the first about 18 months of all of this stuff, it was very much a duopoly. I mean, it was OpenAI with ChatGPT and the OpenAI API and some of those sort of things, and NVIDIA, right? I mean, those were sort of the Wintel of this technology stack. And the reality is, whenever you have that much, I don't want to say lock in, but that much sort of restriction of choice, it doesn't allow the innovation that has to happen. And even if we think about like, well, the last thing that was a major change. So like the smartphone space. Well, the iPhone kind of got out there early. Well, the iPhone, was out there for a year or so, and then the Android phone was out a year later. So even in that case where we had something that became enormous, you had two things going on. One, you had, multiple choices at multiple price points for people. And then number two, those two technologies by themselves weren't the thing that drove the smartphone revolution. It was those two things plus the evolution of cloud computing and the ability to do things, build something, build a prototype in a month and be able to do it on demand, and the app stores, right? The app stores of both of these things. So again, we have to remember, a little bit of putting things in perspective. I think the second thing is, we've seen even over the last couple of months, right? Like we have this fascination with, this is the standard. And again, this goes back to the idea that winner take all. And so we are so fascinated and so obsessed with figuring out what's the standard going to be for a thing. And if we even think about the last year, a year and a half, 2 years, right? We started with sort of like Gen AI, and it was like, oh, wait a second, what even is this thing, right? Like people were like, what even is, what can a Chat GPT thing like do, and they start to think through use cases. And then immediately after that, it was this flurry of, other frontier models and the rush of like, well, is GPT-4 the biggest thing? Is the Gemini one the biggest thing? Is Llama the biggest thing? Is whatever it was. And that was, again, this rush in 3 to 6 months. And then you had Llama, and it was like, okay, Llama is sort of open source. And it was like, okay, well, are we, we got to go through the thought process of like, is that going to be how things are going to work? Are they going to be proprietary? Are they going to be open source? Is that going to happen? We've seen, DeepSeek, come out and sort of change some of the thought process. Do I need all of the NVIDIA stack? Can I do something less? Can I open source more than was done before? We've already seen people sort of, stop thinking about, oh, well, what can chatbots do? And that's so old. And everything now is going to be agentic, right? And, we've now been 3 or 4 months into people looking at like MCP as a standard, but we've got, multiple other standards, A to A, that Google just put out, right? So there is such a rush of new stuff and innovation, which is fantastic. And you can see some interesting things happen in that. But at the same time, if you think about like that from an enterprise perspective, that sort of pace isn't sustainable in the enterprise, right? It's sustainable in pockets. It's sustainable for a project, for POCs, but it very much aligns to, why we're seeing what we're seeing within the enterprise, which is, I've got to find some standards and I've got to find some stability. I've got to find some consistency within this for a period of time in which people can learn the technologies, they can get it in ways that they want to, so there is yes, there is, some concern about like, is this stuff happening fast enough? And again, CEOs are right to be concerned about like, I don't want my business to get stuck behind. But at the same time, if we look at the market holistically, the amount of change that's happened, the sort of fluctuation of standards, even over 3-month periods and 6-month periods, the sort of complete resetting of what the cost of technology looks like, and unsureness of whether or not that will become down to a point that we've sort of come to expect. And again, we're not exactly sure what that is. Is that something that will be advertising supported? So it will, kind of usage will be zero. Is it some other number? Is it going to be per seat? Is it going to be per usage basis? Like all those things are still kind of being shook out, and people are still experimenting and still figuring out what they all mean. And so again, I keep looking at these, kind of these proclamations, and in the consumer space, I think the consumer side of it is sort of going through certain rationalization, right? Like, did I need to put $100 billion into that? What is the realistic time frame for, 20 new data centers to come along? Like, when is NVIDIA going to stop having shortages of chips? When will there be secondary and tertiary and fourth and fifth viable hardware alternatives? Like, those are all really viable things, right? But I think from an enterprise perspective, when we start looking at the deployment of stuff, I think we have to, again, kind of come back to a little bit of suspending the hype of AI and getting into, yes, some of those things that Mark laid out are absolutely very realistic, right? The ones around, how are you getting data into your models? Very, very big challenge, right? And we're seeing more and more companies that are figuring out people with deep data background, right? Who's driving the strategy within your organization? Again, this is the sort of intermixing of the enterprise and consumer behaviors, the ability for anybody to go out and get a ChatGPT account or a ChatGPT super premium account and sort of be like, well, maybe this is our enterprise strategy for this group, but I don't know that approach is going to work company wide. And like, who's really looked at what data went into that? How was it trained? What sort of legalities do we have? How do we prevent it from hallucinating? There still isn't like a clear standard or a clear framework for agentic. Yes, there are a whole bunch of things, LangChain and all sorts of other stuff around it, and MCP. But again, from an enterprise perspective, and something that you would expect sort of company wide or even multi-project wide, we're still in very, very early days. So I think all those things are stuff to consider. They're not necessarily excuses. I think the other thing is, I look at all this stuff, if I boil it down to maybe even the most basic thing, if the the title of this article and the title of the sort of criticism by Mark is, why AI isn't meeting expectations. I think the first question maybe you ask yourself is like, what are the expectations, right? Like, what are enterprise expectations, right? And I think you can start with a pretty sort of simple kind of checklist, right? The first one would probably be, number one, are we trying to augment our processes? i.e., we have processes that are either, involve a bunch of manual steps or involve a bunch of people doing things. And these could be highly trained people or, lightly trained people or highly skilled or lightly skilled people. But is the first thing we're trying to do to look at those processes and augment them, right? We want to make them 10, 20, 50% better. Or is the goal to say, we want to look at those processes and figure out a way to take a bunch of cost out of them, right? And I think those are two very, very viable things, right? So think about it as sort of like augmentation, kind of improve the processes by some amount because we think we're going to drive greater value out of them, or reduce the cost of those things. And that reduction in cost might be also a reduction in people. Okay, those are fine. I think those are good starting points. You could look at any process and sort of apply those two things to them. I think the next thing, if you're talking about expectations, is, well, what is your expectation? Are you expecting to put a number against this? We want to show that we are improving this by 20 or 30%. Okay, great. Now you've got something that you can go after. You've got a metric. We want to reduce the cost of this by X amount of percent. We want to reduce the number of people by whatever. Now you've got a thing. But I think as an industry, we don't yet kind of have those numbers unless we're just simply putting them in sort of standard, business numbers, right? Like, speed gained or cost reduction or, headcount reduction or, improved efficiency, whatever those things. I think we need to sort of talk about what some of those numbers are, start to have some baselines for your industry. And a lot of this sounds very old and stodgy. And it's like, well, yeah, because those sort of models have worked for multiple decades as new technologies have sort of evolved. And I think we're sort of skipping a little bit of some of this because we're like, well, AI just needs to move fast and we can't kind of use old methods and methodologies. And there's some truth to that. But at the same time, you can't sort of say we're not meeting expectations without setting what those expectations are. And I think if you asked most CIOs, CEOs, and so forth, like, okay, I know you want to get to AI. I know you're concerned about it. I know you want to get ahead of it. What's your expectations? I think the first question to ask is like, what are those expectations? And then you can sort of balance from there. So anyways, I think Mark's article and the framing of it is both a little bit, clickbaity. And I think at the same time, he does a very good job of going into some details of things in order to leverage both some best practices that are out there, as well as some things that we've seen in the past around, when new modern applications were getting built, sort of the cloud native revolution, was that done in a certain way? Did that succeed? Did people eventually realize like, oh, I can't drag as much baggage along with me and I should sort of go native? We've seen those patterns evolve, and he talks about that in this as well. So I think it's worth taking a look at. I think it's also worth remembering certain context because right now the headlines and the articles, the writers, the media, and again, this isn't a knock on the media. They're reporting what vendors are publishing and pushing out there. Being fascinated by the scale of the consumer side of things, can often sort of skew what the realities are of what the enterprise can do, right? Or what a realistic project can do. So, and I think kind of having some context of that, having some context of we've only been doing this for a couple of years. Your individual company might have only been doing this for a few months. You might have only started putting teams in place and learning this stuff. And the reality is that, if you went to somebody and said, like, what is the lamp stack of AI, you're going to get a lot of different things, and you're going to get some stuff that's still evolving. I think there's patterns that are still very much evolving. And so it's a great time to be learning. It's a great time to be figuring things out. It's a great time to be experimenting. But I also think it's a time in which we have to sort of temper expectations about what expectations are. Just because, right now, again, there's so much innovation. It's not that people are missing out on stuff. It's that they're trying to wrap their head around, like, it's like being on a boat. It's like being on a boat and you're trying to find a level because everything is sort of moving around so much, and you're a little worried about getting like seasick. I think there's a certain amount of that that's going on in the market, as much as meeting expectations. And again, I think there's a lot to kind of separating out what are consumer expectations for the big 6 or 7 companies that are investing hundreds of billions of dollars into this, and what that means in terms of translating it into enterprise usefulness for your company, for your project, for your region, whatever that thing might be. So anyways, thought it was a good article. There was a lot to think about in it. I think there's also a lot to sort of, put some reality to, or kind of temper expectations with it. So would love to get your feedback from folks that are doing projects. I know there are plenty out there that are very, very successful today. But there's also, a lot that are still in just the earliest stages. And quite honestly, if we apply the sort of, going back to kind of cloud first principles, the things that like Andy Jassy used to talk about, the earliest days with AWS is, part of your goal is yes, to be successful, to help the business to do things. Part of it is to figure out how to experiment and how to, eventually experiment more quickly, sort of try some things, figure out what you can learn. You're probably going to fail somewhat. Some things are going to be successful. How can you learn quickly, continue to experiment? And so I think, that mindset has to be here as well. Again, it's a little tougher because the cost of AI experimentation still is not cheap enough. It's not fast enough, as just pulling up CPUs in the cloud and so forth. But I think the mindset that he used to talk about is one in which people need to be conscious of, as they're thinking about setting their expectations with it. So, anyways, with that, good article, good opportunity to think about where your company is, set some expectations, set some metrics. Try and be realistic about where you are. Think about what choices you made with technology. Do you feel confident with them? Are they the best you can do right now? Again, those are all sort of valid paths to take right now. So anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Hope you're having a good spring. Hopefully things are going well for you. And again, if we can help you with anything, all of the social media contacts, ways to reach out to us are in the show notes under feedback down at the bottom. So with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.